Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Firstly, I want to thank Deputy Gino Kenny for bringing forward this piece of legislation. I also want to acknowledge Deputy Kenny's legislation reflects a very sincere and a very humanitarian objective to try and minimise suffering and distress at the end of life. And I think we all know somebody who has died in this way, in distress, in pain, and we wouldn't wish it for ourselves. We certainly wouldn't wish it for anybody else. But no matter what way we look at this, assisting someone to die is a very complex issue. Medically, ethically, morally, it is very complex. It also gives rise to criminal justice and constitutional issues. But consideration also needs to be given to the vital public interest in protecting persons who are nearing the end of their lives and who might be, and I'm not saying everyone, but who might be vulnerable and at risk of abuse. In legislation for the complex issue we're legislating, Ireland would become one of only a small number of countries in the world to legislate for assisted dying. We're not currently an outlier in this regard. If I could maybe in my speech this evening deal with a number of issues. Firstly, the existing law in this country, the changes proposed in this bill, the issues of safeguards, and finally our amendment, the merits of detailed consideration by a special Oireachtas committee and the need for a wider public debate on this issue. Currently existing law states it is an offence under the Criminal Law Act 1993 to assist another person in taking his or her life. Prosecution of the offence can result in a term of imprisonment of up to 14 years. The constitutionality of the legislation was upheld by the Supreme Court in its judgment in the Mary Fleming case on the 29th of April 2013. The Court held that there is no constitutional right, and I'm using the Court's language, to commit suicide or to arrange for the ending of one's life at a time of one's choosing. The Court also found that the prohibition on assisted dying was not discriminatory and was not contrary to the European Convention on Human Rights. The courts have said that while it is open to us in the Oireachtas to legislate in this area, it would also be a matter for the courts to consider if whatever the Oireachtas may propose, if it is proposed to change anything, is constitutionally permissible. The private member's bill before us this evening, as proposed, would decriminalise, subject to certain conditions and safeguards, assisting the death of a terminally ill person. The bill does, as the Deputy has outlined, provide a number of safeguards, including that the process is medically led and that the person must be terminally ill, and that is why we have a joint memo here this evening between Justice and Health. In terms of the safeguards, I do think it is very clear that if this House is to legislate in this area of the competing interests of the individual, they will have to be balanced with the wider public interest in safeguarding people who are nearing the end of their life and who might be vulnerable and at risk of abuse. The High Court has made a number of comments in relation to the development and the policing of safeguards, and it held, and I quote, "But such might well be the unintended effect of such a change, specifically because of the inability of even the most rigorous system of legislative checks and balances to ensure in particular that the aged, the disabled, the poor, the unwanted, the rejected, the lonely, the impulsive, the financially compromised and the emotionally vulnerable would not disguise their own personal preferences and elect to hasten death so as to avoid a sense of being a burden on family and society. The safeguards built into any liberalised system would, furthermore, be vulnerable to laxity and complacency and might well prove difficult or even impossible to police adequately. There is a vital public interest in protecting vulnerable persons, which I know all members of this House want to ensure, and it is important that the Oireachtas takes its time to consider the proposed law and the proposed safeguards. In terms of the next steps, the timed amendment that I am proposing this evening to the motion, which has been tabled, proposes that we do take that necessary time to consider what are extremely complex issues. It would mean that the bill would be read a second time in 12 months' time. This is not any attempt to delay, and that a special joint Oireachtas committee would be established to consider this matter in detail, and this committee would be established very soon. Among the issues the special committee would be asked to look at and to consider, and this is inclusive but not conclusive, the medical, ethical and moral issues, as well as criminal justice and again constitutional issues which arise, the issues identified by the High Court in relation to developing and policing safeguards which are needed to ensure that a qualifying person is not subject to any pressure by any third parties, how unintended consequences that create any adverse impact on vulnerable persons could be avoided, the safeguards found in the regulatory regimes prevailing in jurisdictions such as Switzerland, the Netherlands, certain US states such as Washington, Oregon, which already have legislated in this area, and finally what role or legal rights a family member should or could have in the process, and what role the legal profession or those with a function under the law in supporting decision making or making decisions on a person's behalf should have in relation to the process. The Oireachtas Justice and Equality Committee has examined assisted dying in the last Dáil, but I believe it didn't maybe go into the detail that we would like and I would like to see. While it did not come to a conclusion on whether legislative change is required, it did raise a number of questions which do need to be answered if change is to be considered, and I hope that the new Special Oireachtas Committee, if approved, would take up these questions. The new committee would report back to this House within 12 months with recommendations. The subject of assisted dying is complex. It cannot be rushed. I believe a Special Oireachtas Committee is best placed to ensure that there is full consideration of the issues which arise in this bill, and that is why I am asking deputies to support the counter-motion that I am proposing. The counter-motion will give all of us here, as well as I believe the general public, the time to consider the fundamental questions and detail of what is being proposed. On the bill specifically, there are a number of legal and technical issues which we believe require much greater consideration. These include the implications the law would have for other countries with regard to such assistance as an offence, notwithstanding that it obviously takes place outside of their territory. And while it allows for conscientious objection, this legislation, many doctors would equally have an objection to an imposed duty to transfer and enable the death of their patient. That section, if enacted, would likely to be subject of legal challenge. There are other issues and concerns that we do have. In conclusion, Cathaoirleach, the question being asked of the bill and of the House in this bill could not be of a more fundamental importance. It is asking us to consider whether we should legislate to allow some of our citizens who have a terminal illness to choose to end their life. The past decade has seen this country make a series of significant social changes in a relatively short space of time. We do not need to recount the old arguments today, but on every single occasion, each one of us took positions which I believe were sincerely held and honestly argued. Yet the decisions we took, from the introduction of the Protection of Life during Pregnancy Bill to the referendums to bring in marriage equality and to repeal the 8th Amendment, followed years of debate. Once again, debate around a profound social issue cannot be confined to the chambers and the committee rooms of the Oireachtas. Deputy Kenny's bill and the Government's counter-motion establishing an Oireachtas committee, I do think, will hopefully lead to a wider public debate on the merits, the consequences and the implications of assisted dying. One more, each side of the debate must try to respect the opposite point of view. Those who will argue for assisted dying must respect people who feel that it devalues other lives, such as those of our citizens who have life-limiting conditions. Opposition to assisted dying must also acknowledge that advocates for change are motivated by compassion and care for their fellow citizens, and I in particular think and refer to Michael Nugent, who came before the Oireachtas Justice and Equality Committee to speak of his late wife Anne, who had medication available to her which would have ended her life. And he said Anne died naturally, as do most people who make these preparations. It's not about the act of dying, it is about the peace of mind one has while one is still alive, of knowing one can avoid unnecessary suffering if one has to. There are deeply held views and indeed worries on both sides, and as we open this debate this evening, I would ask that mutual respect is maintained here in the Oireachtas and across the country more generally. Thank you.